This is the second video on the subject of exception handling, and we're going to look at throwing argument exceptions. Throwing argument exceptions is a way of validating object parameters to include any business logic, and so that can mean validating for a certain range. So we're validating business rules with the business logic, and it's usually going to be handled in the set property procedure. Some possible exception types we're going to see that we might want to throw would be the argument out of range exception, where we pass a parameter in a message. We'll do similar with the argument null exception, and that's for when a box, for example, is left empty, and an argument exception, which is the most general. For the parameter name, we want to pass a string representing the parameter name in error, not the actual name, so you don't want it to be necessarily the variable, but something descriptive and obvious, with an example to come. These exceptions have to be thrown and then handled. So the first thing we're seeing here is inside of a set property procedure, you might have a case where something is out of range, for example, and we want to throw an argument out of range exception. You can see here that the parameter name is pay level, and the message is valid pay levels, and it uses constants to indicate what those valid pay levels are, and that'll provide a really useful message to the end user, or that's the hope. That's inside the set procedure, and that's the exception being thrown. Now inside a try catch block, that code needs to be handled, and that'll be done likely at the presentation level. So there's a try and then a catch. It's going to catch this exception as an argument out of range exception, and if the parameter name is pay level, then it can show that message. And so that's where you use the parameter name to identify what type of parameter is an error. So going to look at some code again. Here we are looking at the payroll.vb, which is the actual class, not the form. We're looking at the property procedures for the payroll object. First thing we've got here is the hours property procedure. You can see the get is pretty straightforward. It's just returning a private variable value. Inside the set, we've got the minimum hours defined and the maximum hours defined, the same as they have been for this particular business problem, where an employee might have their hours entered at a minimum of 1 hour and a maximum of 60 hours as decimal values. Here we're doing a check that if it is greater than the minimum hours or equal to the minimum hours and less than or equal to the maximum hours, the employee hours are equal to that value. If it's outside of that range, we're going to throw this argument exception that's going to use the hours worked as its parameter name. This is the message here. That's what will be handled at the presentation level. Looking down at the rate property procedure, we see here the get is just the same, but the set has a similar set of business rules for indicating what a valid wage is. The minimum wage is 1025D, which was probably minimum wage back when this program was developed originally, and the maximum wage is $42 an hour, and I have no idea why that is. We validate that something is inside that range, and if it's not, then we're sending this exact string, which is very similar to the one that was on the slide. That's an argument out of range exception that we're throwing right there. This is inside the property procedures, so what will happen on the actual form is, in this case, the pay object has been defined at the top of the program. And so down below, when we go to set those property values, it's inside the try, and here we're checking that the form input hours are valid, we're checking that the form input rate is valid. As we discussed in the last one, that might cause its own exception. It might be that the format is incorrect, and that'll be handled below in one of those catch blocks. But right here, we're actually using the set property procedures for the pay object. And so the form input hours is being set to this property for the pay object, and the form input rate is being set for the property for the rate. When this is called, it's running that set procedure, and depending on the value entered, it may cause this argument out of range exception to be thrown. It may be that an exception emerges right here, and it will be caught by these catch statements. And so here we've got one that catches an argument out of range exception. Here's the message it will show, and here it actually checks the parameter name and changes the focus based on whatever field was in error. And that's how an argument out of range exception might be handled at the presentation level.